The beginning of the movie opens with a scene of our protagonist, Emma, when she was young. We see her playing with her sister Jane, as she assumes the role of the princess. Meanwhile, Jane plays the Prince Charming, a role that is always assigned to her. In this scene, we find out that Emma is the optimistic one, while Jane is the sibling that leans towards practicality. Fast forward to the present, Emma meets up with Jane for breakfast. Jane's boyfriend, Greg, is also there. The couple doesn't waste time and tells Emma they are engaged. Emma finds out that they have settled for a cheap ring and are planning to hold the wedding in a month. This is a plan that contradicts Emma's fundamental beliefs about romance. Greg abruptly leaves to take care of some work, leaving the sisters to discuss the wedding plan. Emma agrees to help her sister some other time, since she'll be busy talking to her investor that day. Later, we see Emma entering her bookstore, Barouch Books. Upon entering, she greets two of her employees, Philip and Marilyn. Emma tells them about her sister's engagement, but her expression shows that she's envious. Marilyn hands her some morning coffee, while Philip reassures her that she'll eventually find her Prince Charming one day. While walking, Emma bumps into Eric, the son of her investor Frank. Frank sees Emma and introduces her to his son. He then takes the conversation to another room and tells her the reason why his son is there. Frank wants Eric to observe Emma's business for 3 weeks. He praises his son and tells Emma that Eric's insights have helped his other investments. Emma isn't pleased by the request, but Frank leaves before she can protest. Eric sees someone using their laptop at the bookstore and asks Emma if she provides free Wi-Fi. When she reveals that she does, Eric asks if doing so helps drive book sales. Right off the bat, we see that Eric is assessing Emma's business practices. Emma describes her store as a place of culture and enchantment. However, Eric tells her that businesses need more than enchantment to thrive. Emma doesn't like how he criticizes the store and implies that observers like him should keep quiet. Their business relationship is off to a rocky start. That night, Emma arrives home and tells her sister about Eric. However, she doesn't rant about it for too long, as she wants to focus on planning Jane's wedding. Emma shows Jane a thick book containing loads of information about wedding planning. Despite having only weeks to prepare, Emma is determined to give her sister the perfect wedding. The next day, Eric starts criticizing how Emma labels the sections of the store. Despite the labels being fun puns, it doesn't help guests locate book genres. He also finds out that Emma doesn't have a website for her bookstore because she insists on keeping her business simple. Eric starts messaging a web designer to help Emma get her website started. However, she stops him and reminds him that he's not allowed to make decisions for the store. They continue discussing the store's name and how it's such an obscure word that people don't understand. Emma explains that Barouch is a fancy chariot and is a perfect metaphor for how reading is capable of transporting readers to another world. Eric makes a comment on how Emma's hopeless romantic perspective is responsible for her store's ambience. However, he points out that such an attitude also makes her blind to the reality of running a business. Emma thinks he's being presumptuous, despite only knowing her for 2 days. They continue arguing about their respective views on romance and relationships, but they never see eye to eye regarding such topics. Their argument comes to an end when Emma puts on a costume and reads a book in front of the children. Eric waits for her to finish reading the story. Afterward, he announces that the book Emma just read is discounted by 20%, and the kids should tell their parents to buy it. She gets mad at him for making another business decision on the spot. However, before she can give him a piece of her mind, she is interrupted by a customer. Emma tries to make the customer wait, but upon glancing at him a second time, she notices that the customer looks like a prince straight out of a storybook. She trips while approaching him, and naturally, he catches her. He introduces himself as Landon Cress and starts flirting with her in a way that she finds delightful. Meanwhile, Eric is looking at them like he's watching a cheesy romance scene. Landon asks Emma where the poetry books are. He's looking for a particular book called Buckwheat. She immediately knows what book he's talking about, and together, they recite one line from it. Unfortunately, their romantic moment is cut short when Eric calls for Emma. Eric informs Emma that he sold 9 copies of the Storytime book. This comes as a surprise to Emma, since it's been only a few minutes since her Storytime session ended. Landon finds the book that he's looking for and buys it. He also asks Emma out for dinner, to which she enthusiastically agrees. Landon takes one of her business cards before leaving, promising to call her. Eric makes a side comment about how Emma indeed has a fairytale complex. In the next scene, Jane arrives home, and Emma tells her about the guy she met. Greg arrives too, but he's just there to tell Jane that he needs to skip the planning session again to do some work. Jane tries convincing him to stay, but he insists that the work is paying good money, so he has to go. After Greg leaves, Jane asks Emma about the guy she was talking about earlier. Jane starts looking up Landon Cress on the internet. While doing that, Emma finds out that her sister already bought a wedding dress. Still, despite how quickly Jane picked it, Emma thinks it's a good dress. Jane proceeds to look at Landon's social media, and the sisters find out that he travels a lot. His family also owns a puppy rescue center, which makes him look more like a perfect Prince Charming. The next day, Eric asks Emma about an empty space in the bookstore. She tells him that she's reserving that space for a puppet theater. During the conversation, Eric points out that such an item isn't a necessity for the business. This comment gets on Emma's nerves, and she tells him that she isn't asking for his input. It's clear that the friction between them is getting worse. Later, a vase of flowers is delivered to the bookstore. Emma reads the card attached to it and finds out that Landon sent them. The card calls her a book goddess, which she finds sweet. However, Eric chimes in and tells her that he thinks Landon forgot her name, hence why he opted for a nickname instead. Wanting to prove Eric wrong, Emma calls Landon. As expected, Landon doesn't immediately recognize Emma when she introduces herself, until she mentions her bookstore. She then thanks him for the flowers, and confirms her attendance for their dinner date later. Eric rolls his eyes and heads to the private office. At the office, Eric tells Emma that she needs to write a blog for her upcoming website. She expresses her disagreement, but Eric thinks that she's just afraid. He insists that she work on the blog that night, while Eric works on getting the website running. When Emma points out that she has a date, Eric snaps back by asking if her personal life is more important than the business. Emma walks out of the office, fuming. Eric catches up to her and suggests that they make a bet. Eric wagers that if Emma is still interested in Landon after a month, then he will personally buy a puppet theater for her. However, if she doesn't like Landon by that time, then she is going to listen to his business advice. Emma is confident that she'll still be interested in Landon even after a month, so she agrees to the bet. Later, Emma tries to write a blog before preparing for her date. However, she is stuck, unable to think of anything to write. Fortunately, Jane arrives and helps her pick out a dress. At one point, Emma starts complaining about Eric, but Jane snaps her back to the moment. Later that night, Landon finally arrives and picks up Emma. Landon takes Emma to a place where he prepares a fancy moonlit picnic for her. The table competes with fine wine, and the area is surrounded by pretty flowers. Emma asks Landon if he travels a lot, and he reveals that he's recently been to Costa Rica. He also talks about his love for poetry. Landon brings out a poetry book and reads a line from it. Emma can't help but stare at Landon like she's the luckiest girl on earth. After the date ends, Landon makes sure to take Emma back to her home. He also promises to call her soon. Later, Emma receives a call from Eric, and he starts the conversation off by asking about the date and making fun of Landon. He quickly changes the topic and asks if Emma has finished the blog. The conversation gets nowhere as the two just throw sarcasm and snarky remarks at each other. After the call ends, Emma finally gets some writing done. She starts her blog with a tale about when she and her sister were young. The scene then transitions to the next day, as Emma reads the rest of her finished blog in front of everyone in the bookstore. Frank praises Emma for her great work, and Eric gives a compliment as well. Later that day, Emma finishes telling another story to the children. Eric approaches her and pitches the idea of adding a cookbook section in the store. He suggests inviting a renowned local chef to hold a book signing event at Emma's store. It will create good press, which will benefit the business. Emma doesn't think a famous chef would be interested in her store, but Eric points out that he can pull some strings for the sake of the business. With that being the case, Emma has no objections. A moment later, Marilyn walks in to give Emma a gift sent by Landon. It's a golden, expensive-looking bracelet. Emma thinks the gift is a sign that Landon is thinking about her. On the contrary, Eric thinks that such a gift is a sign that Landon doesn't know Emma very well. She dismisses his comment and reminds him that he'll lose the bet, so she points out the type of puppet theater she wants. In the next scene, we see Emma writing a new blog entry. Her sister Jane suddenly calls, asking her if she wants to join her for a cake tasting appointment. Emma asks why Greg isn't coming with Jane, and we find out that he's absent again due to work. Jane pleads to her sister that she needs her, so Emma agrees. Later, Emma joins Jane at a restaurant, and they sample some delicious desserts. Jane asks Emma about Landon, regarding his education and other basic information. Oddly enough, Emma admits that such topics were never broached during their first date. Instead, she talks about a night of reading poems and sharing musical interests. The more Jane finds out about her sister's romantic week, the more she tries to compare her love life to Emma's. She suggests going on a double date, so that Greg might learn a thing or two about romance from Landon. When Emma mentions Eric in the conversation, Jane starts looking him up online. The sisters find out that Eric is actually a CEO of a company that specializes in saving failing businesses. At first, Emma doesn't believe it's the same guy, but after seeing his picture, all doubts fly out the window. That night, Emma goes on another date with Landon. Her date drones on and on about the fancy food on the menu. Meanwhile, she can hardly concentrate due to her recent discovery about Eric. When she tries to talk about what's bothering her, Landon changes the subject. He insists that it's better for them to enjoy their night, instead of focusing on boring talks about work. Looks like Mr. Perfect is finally showing his red flags. That night, Emma loses sleep over thinking about her failing business. She still can't believe Eric's true identity and what his presence means for the future of her store. When Emma arrives at her bookstore the next day, she confronts Eric. She tells him about finding out his true identity, and he confirms that he is indeed there to save her business. Before leaving the office, she rants about what her business means to her, and expresses her concerns about the future of Barouch Books. Emma talks to Marilyn and Philip, and asks them to make an espresso for her. Eric shows up and asks for the coffee as well. Emma inhales deeply, knowing that she can't avoid having an intense business conversation with Eric. Moments later, Eric and Emma take a walk outside while drinking coffee. She asks him how badly her business is doing. Eric admits that without any change, Emma's bookstore will be in serious financial trouble after 6 months. Emma feels bad for not seeing clearly how her business is failing. Eric tells her not to beat herself up and focus on fixing the situation. He points out that back then, he saw her business as just another number on the ledger, but after some time, he's realized that it's a special place. Eric lays out his plan to save Emma's business. This turns her mood around, and she suddenly becomes motivated to put Eric's plan into action. However, before that can happen, they have to visit Frank's office. During the visit to Frank's office, Eric lays out his plan on how to make Barouch Books more well-known. He brings up the book signing event and the work they are doing with the website. All they need is an additional capital investment from Frank to keep the ball rolling. After hearing Eric's ideas, Frank agrees to provide more money. Emma is happy to hear Frank's approval, and she's also happy to hear Eric describe her bookstore in such a positive way. Later that day, Emma prepares to do a lot of work at the store. Eric is shocked that she's going to pull an all-nighter, so he volunteers to help her out. Later, Emma continues talking about more ideas to improve their sales. However, their conversation is interrupted by Mr. Prince Charming himself, Landon. Emma is pleasantly surprised that Landon brought a puppy inside the bookstore. He invites her to go on a romantic date, consisting of all the cliches one can think of. Surprisingly, Emma declines Landon's invitation so she can continue finishing the work she needs to do at the bookstore. She suggests that they move the date to later that week, so Landon can meet Jane and Greg too. He agrees and leaves with the puppy, but not before saying a cheesy line. Later that night, Emma and Eric find themselves still having a lot of books to scan. While taking a break, she mentions Eric's love for cooking. He explains that it's a very practical hobby. She comments about him being anti-romantic, but Eric clarifies that he just has a different view of romance than her. To Eric, what really matters in a relationship is the little moments, not the grand gestures. Emma opens up about her parents getting divorced when she was young. We find out that she was raised by a busy mother who didn't take much time to cook meals for her and Jane. However, her mother is responsible for instilling a love for books in Emma. Eric thinks that Barouch Books might not have existed if not for Emma's mother. When they resume working, Emma asks Eric about his career path. We find out that Eric found out that he's skilled in problem solving and built his career out of that. However, sometimes he worries that perhaps his career choice is an indicator that he's only good at criticizing other people's paths, but not good at building his own. Emma suggests that perhaps he's just so good at many things that it's hard to settle for just one. At one point, she verbally slips and tells him that he cares about her. She quickly corrects herself, saying that he cares about her store. We are starting to see that perhaps Eric is interested in more than just a business relationship. The next scene happens early in the morning. Jane rushes into the bookstore with Greg and finds Emma sleeping on the floor a few feet from Eric. She wakes Emma up and asks her why she didn't come home, stating that she was worried sick and tried calling several times. Eric wakes up and explains what they were doing all night, which is scanning books, of course. Frank also arrives, and Jane apologizes for calling him, thinking there was an emergency. Before the couple leaves, Emma mentions the double date with Landon, and Jane confirms their attendance. Suddenly, Eric tells Emma that he needs to leave to take care of some business in Aspen. Emma asks him if he'll be back in time for the book signing event. Eric reluctantly confirms, but he seems uneasy. It's obvious that Eric is leaving because he's starting to catch feelings for Emma, so he decides to take some time away from her to sort out his emotions. After he leaves, we can see a hint of sadness in Emma's expression. The following scenes show Emma's day-to-day activities as she prepares for the upcoming event. We see her busy at the bookstore, and on most nights, she's busy writing for her website's blog. We also see Eric reading Emma's blogs occasionally, to check how she's doing. In the next scene, we finally see the double date. Greg is flabbergasted by how expensive the food on the menu is. Fortunately, Landon insists on paying for everything. For a short while, the sisters talk about the wedding venue and how it's the place where they played a lot when they were young. After dinner, Emma can't help but start talking about the list of things she needs to get done before the big event. Landon cuts her off, telling her to leave the work talk at the store. Emma points out that he seems disinterested whenever she tries to vent about her work life. Mr. Prince Charming tries to dig himself out of a hole by arguing that he just wants to know if Emma thinks about him more than she thinks about work. Emma poses a smile as a response, but deep inside, she realizes her ideal man might not be as good as she thought. In the next scene, we see Emma swamped with work. Marilyn checks on her and offers to make some coffee for her. Emma then remembers that her favorite cookies are in her drawers, so she opens them. To her surprise, there is more than one box of cookies there. Emma realizes that Eric bought a few before he left. She can't help but smile. Emma goes to the front desk and finds that Landon has sent another batch of flowers. This time, the message on the card contains an apology for how he acted on their last date. Emma doesn't seem too enthusiastic about the delivery. Perhaps she's having doubts about her feelings for him. She heads back to her office after reminding her employees about the upcoming book signing event. While Emma is making a business call, Eric shows up. He sees the flowers on the table, and Emma tells him that those are apology flowers from Landon, but she doesn't reveal anything more. After catching up, Eric brings out a rare edition copy of Emma's favorite book. She didn't think he would give her something like that. Suddenly, Emma receives a call from her sister canceling their plans for the evening. Jane wants to spend time with her fiancé. After the call, Eric prepares a sandwich while they continue their conversation. Emma is impressed that he can make an improvised dish, while she barely knows how to make an omelet. Eric tells her that he's willing to teach her how to cook if she wants. The conversation turns awkward when Eric mentions that the cooking lesson will be like a date. Emma clarifies that, despite the apology flowers, she and Landon are still dating. Eric apologizes for the misunderstanding with a pained expression. Emma didn't think they had something going on, which is a valid point, given that Eric never explicitly expressed romantic interest until now. Upon arriving home, Emma sees Jane in a miserable state. Her sister tells her that Greg bailed on her again and chose to take another job instead of helping her with wedding preparations. Jane thinks she's ready to call off the wedding. She continues to rant about Greg and even wishes he was more like Landon. While Jane is discussing her woes regarding Greg, Emma realizes that she, too, feels dissatisfaction with her current relationship, but differently. The next morning, Emma sees Eric at her office. He gives her some papers and a few instructions regarding the preparation for the event. She notices that he seems to be in a hurry to leave, so she stops him and insists that they talk about what happened yesterday. Unfortunately, they are interrupted by Landon suddenly arriving to take Emma out for lunch. Mr. Prince Charming has impeccable timing. Fast forward to the book signing event. Baroche bookstore is packed with people. Emma is nervous, but Philip and Marilyn reassure her that she's going to be fine. Eric arrives and reminds Emma that she needs to deliver a speech to introduce her guest. She starts panicking, so Eric takes their conversation to the office and gives her a pep talk. He reminds her how passionate she is at explaining what her store is all about. All she has to do is deliver a similar speech. Emma thanks Eric for the encouragement, grabs his hand, and they stare endearingly at each other before she goes back out to deliver the speech. Moments later, Emma delivers a masterful speech about the bookstore and what it represents. She relates her speech to her guest and how the store is a place for the famous chef, Carolyn Lake, to celebrate a proud moment of her life by releasing her first cookbook. After the speech, Emma receives a round of applause. When Emma tries to approach Eric, she is intercepted by Landon, who kisses her unexpectedly. We see Eric watching them kiss as his heart shatters into tiny pieces. When Emma finally reaches Eric's location, he's gone. Frank congratulates her and tells her that Eric has already left, since he needs to take care of more work. Emma is disappointed that he left in the middle of the party. The next day, Marilyn shows Emma another bouquet sent by Landon. This time, Emma sighs. She's finally getting tired of all the extravagant gifts. Marilyn also shows her another gift, a puppet theater placed in the empty spot of the store. She immediately knows who sent it. Emma tells Marilyn about the bet she made with Eric. However, she also reveals that Eric didn't lose the bet, since she's no longer interested in Landon. She feels guilty for not being happy, despite being with her ideal man. Marilyn points out that it's understandable, given that Eric was the one who was there for her when it truly mattered. Out of the blue, Greg calls Emma, informing her that he can't find Jane. He finally realizes that he's been causing Jane a lot of stress, and is now worried he might lose her. Emma tells him that she'll find Jane and call him back. In the next scene, Emma finds Jane at their favorite park and asks her what's going on. Jane tells Emma that she had enough and then starts talking about Landon. Before she can finish her sentence, Emma tells her that she is breaking up with Landon. Emma then goes on to talk about how despite Landon being romantic, he's not there when it matters. He's not interested in the things that matter to Emma. Then she starts building up Greg and talks about his strengths, which makes Jane reconsider her plans to call off the wedding. Jane gives Emma a hug and leaves to go back and meet Greg. Still at the park, Emma calls Landon and tells him to meet her, and he comes right away. Emma finally musters the courage to tell Landon how she truly feels. She admits that despite wanting a romantic partner, it never occurred to her if she herself was a romantic. Now she realizes that a fairytale romance is not what she needs. In the next scene, we see Greg having a conversation with Jane. He admits his mistakes and promises to change. He also pulls out a more expensive ring and proposes again. This explains why he is always out working, because he's been saving to buy that ring. Fast forward to the night after Jane and Greg's wedding. Emma attends as the maid of honor. She watches her sister experience a happy ending. Meanwhile, on another side of the city, Eric is taking a taxi to the airport. At one point, he asks the driver to stop. We see him reading Emma's latest blog entry on her website, He realizes that she's talking about him, about how it's him that she really loves. Next, we see Emma drinking alone while watching Jane and Greg dance. Then, all of a sudden, Eric appears in front of her. He tells her that he hates Happy Ever After because the story ends there. He points out that Happy Ever After is just where the story starts to get good. The film ends with them kissing and starting their relationship.